Hello, third graders. I wanted to share another chapter of Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball by Debbie Dady and Marcia Thornton Jones. Today we are going to be reading chapter 8. Before we go on to chapter 8, let's recap chapter 7. So we're still seeing some of those patterns of behavior with the characters. Melody, again, continues to be observant. So is Howie. We're also understanding more about Howie's grandmother, that she knows information about the leprechauns. She's also a kind lady. Howie's inquisitive. He wants to know what is going on with this leprechaun story. So if we're thinking about our summary, we can use the somebody wanted but so then model. So previously in Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, the chapter starts out with Howie's grandma. She is a kind Irish lady. She offered Howie and his friends cookies, and she's going to tell them the true story of the leprechauns. In the story, the leprechaun emperor wanted to rule the lands by keeping a stolen green magic fairy stone. But the leprechauns were becoming a nuisance or problem with it. They went around the world tricking anyone they could, and the vampires became tired of it. So the vampires decided to get the fairy stone away from the emperor by sending a spy into the emperor's castle to steal it. She was a teacher. Then the vampires banished or sent the leprechauns to Ireland. Leprechauns can only leave the Emerald Isle for 3 days. So the kids start to wonder about Mrs. Jeepers and Mr. O'Grady after the story. And Eddie sets out to prove Mr. O'Grady is not a leprechaun. So I'm starting to wonder, what exactly is it that he is going to do? I know his patterns of behavior are to be kind of a problem. So in chapter 8, that is titled Master Trickster, I'm wondering if Eddie is going to continue to play some more of his tricks, or is the Master Trickster going to be Mr. O'Grady? Just like previously in the story, how Mr. O'Grady seemed to have some control over the basketballs. Is he going to get the best of Eddie? So let's read to find out. Chapter 8, Master Trickster. I've got it, Eddie said the next morning as Howie, Melody, and Liza met under the oak tree. Got what? Melody giggled. Chicken pox? You should get a job with the circus. You're so funny, Eddie snapped. Go on, Howie urged. What were you going to say? I know how to prove Mr. O'Grady isn't a leprechaun, Eddie said. How? Liza asked. If he's a leprechaun, like you think, he'll be able to out-trick me, Eddie explained as he grabbed his book bag and headed inside. Wait, Melody yelled. It could be dangerous to make a leprechaun mad. But Eddie didn't listen to his friends as they followed him into the school. You don't know who you're dealing with, Howie pleaded. Mr. Potato Head doesn't know who he's dealing with, Eddie snapped as he hung up his jacket in the hallway. But he'll find out during gym class. Melody, Liza, and Howie tried to talk to Eddie during class, but Mrs. Jeepers flashed her eyes to silence them. For once, Eddie didn't mind. Just before gym, Eddie raised his hand. Yes? Mrs. Jeepers asked in her strange accent. May I please be excused? Eddie asked as politely as he knew how. Mrs. Jeepers raised her eyebrows and looked hard at him, but then she slowly nodded her head. You must hurry. We will be ready to leave for physical education in less than 5 minutes. Eddie nodded and rushed out of the room. He got back just as the class was lining up. Nobody noticed that Eddie was wearing his jacket as he slipped into line between Howie and Liza. What are you going to do? Liza asked with concern. Eddie patted his bulging jacket pocket. I'm going to prove that I'm the master trickster. The third graders entered the gym. Mr. O'Grady was standing on the other side of the gym bouncing a basketball. He looked from face to face, but he didn't look in anybody's eyes. Top of the morning to you, he called. Won't you be a joining me for a little game of basketball? Eddie beat everybody to the other side of the gym and stood in front of Mr. O'Grady. The little man glanced at Eddie's raised hand. "What would you be a-wantin'?" Mr. O'Grady asked. Eddie looked at Howie and grinned before he answered Mr. O'Grady. "Can we dance again today?" "I thought you would rather be a-shootin' hoops." Mr. O'Grady glanced around the gym. "But 'twould be a pleasure to be teaching you another Irish jig." "No," Eddie interrupted. "I want to teach you a dance of ours." Mr. O'Grady touched the leather pouch hanging from his waistband and gently tugged on the string. "And what might you be callin' this dance?" Eddie grinned as he pulled a small jar out of his pocket. "It's called the Honey Bee Waltz," he yelled as he unscrewed the lid, "and it's guaranteed to keep you hopping." And with that, Eddie lightly rolled the jar toward Mr. O'Grady's feet. Carrie was the first to scream, "Bees! Watch out for the bees!" And then she ran out the door. Looking at the picture, see Eddie in the middle with the jar of bees and everybody running away from it. But I'm noticing Mr. O'Grady in the back just smiling. That's interesting. The jar broke and honeybees swarmed out and onto Mr. O'Grady's bright red sweatsuit. "Watch out!" Liza screamed. "They'll sting you." But Mr. O'Grady didn't seem upset at all. Instead, he reached into his leather pouch and pulled out the small red stone. One by one, the bees flew away and out the open gym window. "Wow!" Howie yelled. "How did you do that?" "To be sure," Mr. O'Grady chuckled. "'Twas just a bit of Irish luck. But since you like to dance so much, we'll have another jig tomorrow." Howie jabbed Eddie. "So much for your honeybee waltz." "Shut up," Eddie muttered as he plopped onto the bleachers. It was then that Eddie found out not all of the honeybees had left. "Ow!" Eddie jumped up and grabbed his behind. "I've been stung!" "Look, everyone," Melody yelled. "Eddie's doing the honeybee waltz." And all the kids laughed as Eddie raced out of the gym. And that is the end of the chapter. Some interesting things that I noticed as I was reading when the kids were going into the gym, although Mr. O'Grady was greeting them, he didn't look anybody in the eyes. And in the picture, I still think it's very interesting that he's smiling and not at all concerned about what's going on with the bees. I'm also noticing, too, that when some of these things start to happen, he's rubbing the stone in his pouch. So I'm wondering if that has some significance. We will see in our next chapter.